White House release published Monday, June 30, 2025. National Security Presidential Memorandum/NSPM-5. The President has issued a memorandum outlining United States policy toward Cuba. The goal is to support freedom, democracy, and human rights for the Cuban people. The memorandum states that the Cuban government restricts rights and freedoms. The United States will support the Cuban people and limit funds to the Cuban government. The policy ends economic practices that benefit the Cuban government or its security forces. It enforces the ban on tourism to Cuba and continues support for the economic embargo. The United States will oppose efforts to end the embargo at international forums and will report on conditions in Cuba. The memorandum directs efforts to expand internet access, free press, free enterprise, and lawful travel for Cubans. The wet foot, dry foot policy will not be reinstated. Engagement with Cuba must advance U.S. interests and support human rights, private sector growth, law enforcement cooperation, agriculture, science, and safe aviation. Agencies must begin implementing these policies. Within 30 days, the Secretaries of Treasury and Commerce will adjust regulations on transactions with Cuba. The Secretary of State will identify entities controlled by the Cuban military or security services and publish a list. Financial transactions with these entities will be prohibited unless exceptions apply. Exceptions include U.S. government operations, democracy programs, travel, telecommunications, agriculture, remittances, national security, or as required by law. Within 30 days, the Secretary of the Treasury and Secretary of State will update regulations to enforce the tourism ban. Educational travel must be for legitimate purposes and organized by a U.S. group with a group representative. Non-academic education or support for the Cuban people requires a full schedule of activities that promote contact with Cuban citizens and support civil society. Travelers must keep records of authorized travel transactions for at least 5 years for review by the Department of the Treasury. Within 90 days after finalizing regulations, agencies will review enforcement of travel rules to ensure they match this policy. The Secretary of the Treasury will audit travel to Cuba for compliance. The Treasury Inspector General will inspect these audits and report results to the President within 180 days, and then annually. The definition of prohibited Cuban officials will be expanded to include high-ranking government members, employees of key ministries, leaders in state-run media, and others. The Secretary of State and U.S. Representative to the United Nations will oppose efforts to lift the embargo until a transition government is in place as defined by U.S. law. The Secretary of State and Attorney General will report to the President on whether Cuba meets requirements for a transition government, including a review of human rights abuses. The Attorney General will report within 90 days on fugitives from American justice living in Cuba. The Secretary of State and USAID Administrator will review democracy development programs in Cuba to ensure they meet legal criteria. A task force, led by the Secretary of State, will examine ways to expand internet access in Cuba and support freedom of expression through independent media. The Secretaries of State and Homeland Security will continue efforts to discourage dangerous, unlawful migration from Cuba. The Secretary of Defense will support these efforts as needed. An annual report to the President will be provided on U.S. engagement with Cuba to ensure it advances U.S. interests. All actions must protect sensitive government sources and operations. This memorandum amends sections of NSPM-5 from June 16, 2017, and reissues it in full. It replaces previous directives from 2007 and 2016, but does not affect certain executive orders on illegal migration. It does not change legal authority given to agencies or affect budgetary functions managed by the Office of Management and Budget. This memorandum will be carried out in line with existing laws and only if funding is available. It does not create any legal rights or benefits enforceable in court against the United States or its agencies. The Secretary of State will publish this memorandum in the Federal Register. Thanks for listening. The full source material for this summary is in the description below.